Finally, I'm here to talk about the particle 는. Basically, the so-called topic marker is one of its functions, but marking the topic is not its main job. I don't know if you've listened to my episode on word order, but a topic doesn't actually need 는 to be expressed. Simply placing it at the very beginning of the sentence or conversation is more than enough. And just like I mentioned in the second episode, omission, you don't have to repeat the topic over and over again within a single conversation. In fact, you can even have a whole conversation about a topic without ever explicitly mentioning it at all. If you seriously want to understand 는, I highly recommend listening to those previous episodes first before diving into this one. I know it's not incredibly exciting stuff, so I actually suggest just playing this in the background while you do something else. So, what exactly is 는? Some people ask if it plays the same role as the in English, but nope, it doesn't. Why? Because the English word the is only related to nouns. On the other hand, the Korean particle 는 can relate it to a verb in a narrow sense, to the entire sentence, or looking at a bigger picture, to the whole conversational context. If we minimize the use of heavy linguistic terms, I think I can explain both the English the and Korean 는 as limiters. Of course, the English the only acts on nouns to limit the scope of a specific noun, but the Korean 는 limits the scope within which a specific action or state takes place and exists. Let's look at some examples to make this easier to understand. Usually, when you first start learning Korean, the very first sentences you learn begin with 저는, right? Now, give it a track to these sentences. 저는 조이입니다. 제 이름은 조이입니다. 저는 이름이 조이입니다. First of all three of these sentences are grammatically correct sentences. But while 저는 조이입니다 and 제 이름은 조이입니다 make sense, 저는 이름이 조이입니다 probably feels completely confusing, doesn't it? Well, check these sentences. 저는 20살입니다. 제 나이는 20살입니다. 저는 나이가 20살입니다. How about now? In the sentences, 저는 이름이 조이입니다. And 저는 나이가 20살입니다. Can you guess which parts can be omitted? It's actually 이름이 and 나이가. Why? Because universally, in a situation where people are meeting for the first time, when you say a word that means I followed by a noun, of course that's going to be your name. I mean, what else would it be? And you guys know that Korean has a ton of dependent nouns, right? A good example is the counting nouns you learn in the beginner Korean, like 개, 명, 병, 권, things like that. Since 살 inherently means age, you don't even have to say the word 나이 before 살. Just the number and 살 are already more than enough. Then why do people say 제 이름은 조이입니다 and 제 나이는 20살입니다? Well, obviously because they want to speak precisely. But there's one more reason. Without you even realizing it, Korean people don't consciously feel this because it's their native language and their brain just do it automatically. Now take this short self-introduction. 저는 조이입니다. 나이는 20살이고 직업은 선생님입니다. 그리고 서울에 삽니다. Let's look at the nouns that have 는 attached to them one by one. We have 저, 나이, 직업. Here, 저 acts like an announcement to declare that the self-introduction is going to be about 저. Then, 나이 isn't just an age, it's my age. And 직업 is the same. Since I already said 저 at the beginning, I don't need to explicitly say 제 나이 or 제 직업. See how useful a double subject sentence can be? In the end, 나이 and 직업 become subtopics. Another reason is that if you start a conversation with 제 이름은 조이입니다, it can be hard for the listener to predict what the next subtopics will be. So people usually choose to start with 저는. Of course, in the case of a self-introduction, it's short enough that no matter how you start, it's not going to cause any major issues or make it hard to understand. Remember, Korean typically moves from the big picture to the specific details. If you want to hear the answers to these soft topics from the other person, all you have to do is switch the main topic. For example, you could say 미나 씨는요? Then Mina would say 저는 30살이고 회사원입니다. 저는 부산에 삽니다. Of course, what I just explained is a very textbook explanation. So we never know how a real-life conversation will flow, but that is the general rhythm of it. Now let's look at a slightly more complex sentence to grasp the role of 는. I'll say it again. It acts as a limiter. You can think of it as a limiting the scope of a specific action or state, so that it only applies to the noun phrase marked by 는. Because of this, when a simple noun phrase like 물은 is translated into English, it often gets translated as for water, speaking of water, or about water. But like I keep saying, you should understand the Korean particle as a spectrum, so I don't think these translations are always right. However, because English speakers naturally understand the world through individual entities, they find it really hard to accept that while 물은 can mean water, it doesn't always mean ask for water just because it's part of a conversation. It can simply be a part of a sentence like 물은 중요하다. In the end, it's tough for them to wrap their heads around the fact that the translation of a noun phrase like 물은 isn't always the same. So let's go back to the self-introductions we were just talking about. Imagine a room full of people introducing themselves. Naturally, everyone starts their story by saying I. 저는 조이입니다. 20살이고 직업은 선생님입니다. 그리고 서울에 삽니다. And then the next person does the same thing, filling in the blanks of a self-introduction template that was either explicitly given or just understood as a common sense. But in the same situation, someone might say, 제 이름은 이민아이고요. 저는 선생님을 가르치는 선생님입니다. Now, when she introduces her occupation here, imagine she puts a slightly higher pitch or accent on the word 저는 and take a tiny pause right after it. Like, 저는 선생님을 가르치는 선생님입니다. Not like, 저는 선생님을 가르치는 선생님입니다. It has to be like, 저는. I think it's very slight and subtle. As a native speaker, for me, it's very easy to grasp the vibes and nuances, but for you guys, it must be very, very hard. Anyway, in that moment, this 저는 is no longer just a simple I. It sounds more like I am a teacher's teacher with a massive emphasis on I. Or it could sound like who I am, what I am, or ask for me. Let's have just one more quick conversation. Imagine there's a Hawaiian pizza sitting right in front of two people. A says, 나는 하와이안 피자 진짜 싫어. B says, 그래? 나는 맛있는데. Now, does B mean I am delicious or I think it's delicious? Do you still want to translate this 나는 as just I or speaking of me? Just surrender and let go. Flow with the conversation. This 나는 simply limits the scope of what is delicious or specifies the person who feels and thinks that it's delicious. Lately, I've seen many Korean teachers online kindly explaining it to their students that 는 can mark a generic statement. But out of consideration for beginner learners, they tend to hold back from mentioning that this isn't an absolute unchangeable grammar rule. To be honest, I've tried to explain this in my own classes before and failed miserably many times. So more than anyone, I deeply understand what those other Korean teachers are going through. Now, we're going to look into cases where 는 attaches to things other than the subject. And I'll keep it as simple as possible. Remember how I said 는 acts as a limiter? Based on that, try to interpret this conversation. The true meaning isn't stated on the surface. all the nuances and implications are subtly tucked into 는. A says, 너 한국어 잘해? B says, 응, 한국어는 잘해. A says, 무슨 말이야? 다른 나라 말은 못해? 너 영국 사람이잖아. If you look at the key verb chunk in this dialogue, it's 잘하다. Being good at something is limited to Korean language, which is marked by 는, and there is zero information given about anything else he might be good at. That's why there's a very high chance the listener will understand, oh, so you're only good at Korean. But B could also say like, 영어는 내 모국어니까 당연히 잘해야지. I wonder if this helps you why people say you have to listen to a whole conversation in Korean to truly understand what is being said. The moment you attach 는 and grammatically signal that the scope of an action or a state is limited, only the speaker knows the exact underlying meaning. The listener is left to guess, which might make them feel good or it might make them feel upset. But hey, that's what makes conversation interesting. In other words, even Korean people don't know for sure. We're all just guessing. Lastly, let's look at the grammar pattern 기는 하다. First off, 는 can absolutely never attach to a verb stem. Alright? If you do that, it's grammatically wrong. That's why you have to attach the noun forming ending ki to keep it grammatically correct. And this is why you guys usually just memorize the whole pattern out of nowhere and do intense drill practice. But take a look at this. 미안하기는 해? When a native Korean speaker hears this, they're probably going to feel offended. Why? Because 는 was attached to the feeling of being sorry. If you're sorry, you're just sorry. Why are you limiting and isolating the feeling instead of letting be what it is? Grammatically, because the noun forming ending 기 was attached to the verb stem 미안하, the word 미안하기 is now a noun. However, people don't usually use 미안하기 on its own. This is simply a grammatical application added so that we can attach 는. And 하다 is attached right after 미안하기는, right? Since 미안하다 is an adjective, the 하다 that follows it acts as an adjective too. Honestly, you could say 미안하기는 미안해, but you can think of it as being shortened because that's just too long to say. If we translate the vibe of this into English, it's close to are you? Or are you really sorry? To give you a bit more context, unless there's prior information given, this 하다 is no real meaning on its own. You can't even tell if it's a verb or an adjective. If you were to force a one-to-one translation of this "are you" into Korean, since we don't really say pronouns like you anyway, we'd drop the you and be left with just are. How on earth do you just say are in Korean when there isn't an equivalent word? You can't just say 해 because that would sound absurd. You could maybe change it to something like 그래? But since we're speaking this way because we want to accurately deliver a sarcastic, stinging intention to the other person, doing it in the Korean way, 미안하기는 해, fits much better. If you look at other 기는 하다 patterns from this perspective, you might just understand why such complex expressions were born in the first place.